don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. In this episode, I spoke with Katharine Birbalsingh, who is the headmistress of the Michaela School in London. Katharine has become a controversial figure as she talks about multiculturalism and pushes back on some of the policies that most would assume are coming from the left and may be characterized as woke and wokeism. We didn't talk about woke and wokeism, but we did talk about multiculturalism. My first conversation with Katharine was way back in 2018, and I put a link to that in the show notes. We were then talking about the role of inquiry and having an interesting discussion with another school leader who was much more of an inquiry advocate. And as you'll hear me mention, I was in New York City doing some work with a school, and we serendipitously met up and had some good conversation in person. Again, this was years ago before COVID, but we've exchanged messages here and there, sometimes a little bit heated, about inquiry and knowledge and teaching on Twitter, or X as it's now known as. We began this conversation by clarifying and talking about some of her political stances and where she is or how she describes herself, the idea of small c and large c conservatism and the differences between the UK and the United States, the idea of multiculturalism and how she approaches it, which some folks on social media disagree with her vehemently about. And then we made our way to the idea of teaching and the role of inquiry and knowledge and all of the things that discussion entails. One of the things I tried to point out in this conversation, and I wish more people would understand, is that it shouldn't be an either-or. If you're thinking that direct or explicit instruction and inquiry teaching are opposites or in conflict with one another, I don't agree. As you'll hear, I'm quite critical of those folks who are dismissive of the role of knowledge and explicit teaching, but I also think while direct or explicit instruction is necessary and knowledge is necessary, it's not sufficient. Most of the folks, like Katharine, who are engaged meaningfully with students and teaching and learning, actually do engage students in what we would call deeper learning. And while they may not call it inquiry, it certainly has aspects of what I would call knowledge-rich inquiry teaching. And so you'll hear us talk about that and what I think and how she thinks about that and what she agrees with and maybe some disagreements. I wish we had more time to get into more details, but she had a hard stop time. It's always a pleasure to talk with Katharine. She's an interesting character, an interesting thinker. And while some folks certainly disagree with her approach to teaching and learning, and certainly wouldn't be the way that I would run a school or classrooms, I don't think it's bad for kids. It's certainly a choice that those parents are making in sending their kids there, and obviously the results are worth paying attention to. As always, I'd like to remind you to visit our website, which is wegrowteachers.com. There you can find all of our professional development work, including that knowledge-rich inquiry teaching that I was referring to. We also have our PBL Grow 25 early bird registration open. You can see the link for that up at the top of the website. Also, we touched on the issue of school choice briefly in this conversation, and if you're interested in that topic, we'll be hosting a podcast live discussion with Josh Cowan and Neil McCluskey on the 28th, and if you're interested in joining that conversation, you can go to thoughtstretchers.org, and that is an event that you can RSVP for and join us for that. As always, if you have questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to reach out to me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org. And now here's that conversation with Katharine. I am here with the inimitable Katharine Birbalsingh from Michaela. Katharine was a guest on a podcast, it's been 4, 5, 6 years ago, a long time ago. I think right about the time you were starting to become a little bit more well-known as the strictest headmistress. And, of course, we had the privilege or joy or happenstance to meet up in New York City. Boy, that's been before COVID as well. Just on a random fact that we were both there and we had a good conversation there. But welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining and coming back. I want to talk about lots of things. Let's start with some of the more political kinds of things that you deal with and are embroiled in. But maybe a good place to start is how you would describe yourself, and maybe in terms of maybe even placing it in the context of what Michaela does politically. I know you talk about small c conservatism. I make the distinction between capital C and small c, and I've seen you do that some now. So I'm curious how you describe yourself, especially in terms of your work at Michaela.
Yeah. So just to make it clear to your listeners that obviously I'm in England and our school is in England and
right.
Inner city London, with a very typical inner city intake, which has all the issues of the inner city in terms of the kids' backgrounds and the various challenges that come with that. Small c conservatism. Well, I would say it's just sort of old-fashioned traditional values. I call them small c conservative, but you might call them traditional. Believing in not accepting the idea of victimhood and always taking personal responsibility, always sort of pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, and having a goal and pursuing it, very much wanting to live a life of dignity, I would say. And what is a life of dignity? Well, behaving in ways that demonstrate kindness and gratitude, and understand that you're part of a team, and that when you let yourself down, you let a whole bunch of people down, and that you might have a sense of duty towards others and a sense of duty to the whole that you are a part of. We are very patriotic. We believe in the country, and that we are British together. That we might have deference towards the dead, and very much feel a sense of gratitude to those who died in the various wars for us to have the freedom that we have. We work hard because we know that working hard brings success. Now, these are all values that I would say once upon a time really did we're across the political spectrum. That old school lefties, would match with what I'm saying totally. I think increasingly the left has been moving away from many of those values. For instance, embracing a sense of victimhood for various different groups instead of wanting to take personal responsibility. That's just one example. Burning the flag, for instance, and not being patriotic. So they are small c conservative, although I can see how they also map onto big C conservative. But especially in America, I would say your big C conservatives very much sort of think that the only way to fix the school system is through school choice and charter schools. Now, I'm all for school choice and charter schools, but I myself am running the equivalent of a charter school here in England. It's called a free school here, but it is sort of like a charter school. I say sort of because we're not outside of the public school system. We're still very much a public school where our kids are given to us by the local council. We don't run our own admissions, but we have the freedom to make choices for our kids in terms of curriculum and our style of discipline and that kind of thing, which is how I've ended up as strict as headmistress in Britain, they call me, because we're strict and we have a very particular kind of ethos, which would be far more difficult to achieve if we were not a free school or what you would call a charter school. But your big C conservatives always just talk about about school choice. And as long as people can do what they want, leave it to the market, and the market will sort everything. I would argue that in education, that really isn't enough. It might be necessary, but it's certainly not sufficient. And I do think you need small c conservative values to go along with that choice and that freedom. And I don't think the big C conservatives understand that point.
Hmm. I'm curious from an outsider's perspective, and I know you come to the U.S. frequently. When you're looking at that spectrum, sort of left and right and conservative, small c, big C, it's different in the UK than it is here, as you sort of alluded to, and how you see that playing out in Britain. What you described, I would say, is more populist and libertarianism, and the current, I guess, large C conservative movement, Trumpism, MAGA, sort of aligned with that, and actually quite a departure from small c, a lot of small c conservative values. I don't know if you would agree with that, or to the extent that you would agree with that, but it seems pretty obvious to me that in Britain there's a different sort of spectrum, up and down, left and right, that kind of thing. How would you describe that?
I think so. So you guys, your big C's, you want to be able to carry guns, and you got your pickup trucks and the gun, and you go off and you kill the deer.
I did just get a new pickup truck.
Right. Yeah. Like, we just don't have that culture at all. Like, we don't have, like, the idea of owning a gun is so bizarre in England. Like, it's just, we're just completely different. We're European. I mean, sure. So yes, I think that the Trump MAGA guys are much more libertarian at heart, but I do think that a number of those small c conservative values do tend to fall under the Republican banner. A lot of those families in Kansas or wherever, those red states, would be following a lot of those small c conservative values, without really thinking about it. Often the mums would be at home making the dinner, and dad goes out to work and with his gun and his pickup truck, or I mean, obviously I'm stereotyping, but I can see that happening quite a lot. Whereas in New York, which is a lot more liberal, you're picking up a hot dog at lunch. It's a lot faster paced. It's movers and shakers. It's a different thing. So yeah, I do think some of those small c conservative values do map onto them. It's just that, yes, I think the libertarian thing, as you say, means it just sort of blinds them. This obsession with the market. The market can't fix everything, especially not when it comes to education. So I understand, the biggest problem is people don't necessarily understand what's going on in schools. I mean, like, I do think they need to have the freedom to choose what school they want. I'm not saying they shouldn't. But when I go to buy Tropicana orange juice, if I want pulp or I don't want pulp, I can taste the two, and then I can decide what I like, and then I can choose. I do not like orange juice with pulp. I like it without pulp. I'm very clear about that. But what I find constantly is that when I'm trying to give advice to people about schools and what to look for, they just don't know what to look for. And in fact, they're always looking for the wrong things. And, even though you and I might disagree about inquiry and what should happen in the classroom, when parents are looking for schools, the things they say to me are things like, oh, I really like the lockers in this school, so we might choose that school. Or, yeah, this building in the school was really pretty. And I'm always thinking, who cares about the building? Like, what matters is the instruction and the discipline. But they don't understand that. And not only because they just think it's all the same. And they then are choosing their schools sometimes without the right information. And I'm just saying it's a lot harder when it comes to school choice than it is when it comes to choosing what apple you want. Do you want a Granny Smith or do you want a red apple? That's much easier. And I worry that your big C conservatives just don't recognize the complexities behind schooling.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with you. And I've had this conversation. I've actually had two podcasts about school choice recently, and we're actually going to do a sort of a live participatory with both of those guests. One of them, Neil McCluskey from the Cato Institute, which is a libertarian think tank, and then Josh Cowan, who has written a book about school vouchers and the DeVos administration, those kinds of things. So both of them, and then folks can RSVP to join that. All that to say, it is a really tricky landscape. And one of the things that I argue for is precisely what you're saying, is that oftentimes parents, I think, don't understand what school could and should be, and look at sort of superficial markers and metrics and things like that. And then lots of school choice folks, especially on the right, will accuse me, say, well, that's paternalism, and we're that parents know best. And I say, well, but do they? And actually, just recently, here in the States, and I imagine in the UK as well, reading instruction has become a really big topic with Emily Hanford's Sold a Story podcast and phonics and science of reading and all those kinds of things. And parents generally don't know best about teaching of reading, because why would they, right? They're parents. They're busy doing their lives. So I think there is a danger of that sort of paternalism and the expert class saying, well, this is what you should do and this is what's best and those kinds of things. But parents don't really know best. And I don't know. I mean, there's not really a question there, but
let me just say, I mean, I'm not saying that we should tell parents what to do. I do believe very much in people's right to make the wrong choice. If you want your child to go to another school, I think, for instance, our school, Michaela, is the best choice. But if you don't want them to come here, well, you shouldn't send them here. It's up to you. I think you're making the wrong choice, but it's up to you. But I do think that it's incumbent on the state to give people as much information as they can possibly have. And as it is in this country, and I suspect also in the various United States in America, it's impossible to even get into C schools. How on earth are you meant to make it a choice when you don't even know what's going on in the school? You can't visit. You can't see behind. How are you meant to know? Now, and then what they do is they say, oh, but we're putting on an evening event so parents can come and hear from the principal. Well, what's the point of being in the school in the evening? Right. You've got to be there in the day. And then not only that, but you don't just, and then sometimes they say, okay, so we'll put on a 1 hour tour in the day. Okay. But are you allowed to go where you want? Are you allowed to visit any classroom you want? Can I come back tomorrow and see again? Or are you just going to put on a pretty show for me, right?
To your point, when my oldest daughter, who's just about to turn 18, was about ready to start kindergarten, I asked to go take a look at one of the school that she was assigned to geographically, and the response was, we can schedule you a tour. And I said, well, I don't want to see the lockers in the gymnasium. I want to see the instruction and what's happening. And exactly. It was opaque, of course. So sorry, I didn't sort of interrupt you there.
No, but that's exactly right. They then take you around to show you the swimming pool. Who cares about the swimming pool? For goodness sakes.
Yeah, it's nice, but
what matters is the teachers, the instruction, the discipline, the kids. That's what you want to see. So even on that level, people don't realize that's what they should see. The very fact that the tours are organized in such a way to take you to see the building shows that parents want to see the wrong things. They wouldn't organize the tours to see the building if the parents were wanting to see something else. So it's all just upside down. And I spend my life, of course, trying to explain to people how important schools are and to the future of any country, and also to the future of those children. I think we sort of think all schools are the same. Throw a kid into any old school, he'll be fine. He'll come out the same at the end. Literally, your child will be a different person depending on what school you choose for him.
So let's get into the topic of multiculturalism, which you've been Xing about or tweeting about or whatever we call it these days. And I suppose it sort of comes on the heels of the court case, which you won, and people, we certainly disagree about lots of things, but I had defended you and your work because, as you said, you're a school that has particular values and ethos, and folks can choose to go there or not. And if they don't like the rules, then they probably shouldn't choose your school. But maybe you can just briefly encapsulate. I assume the two things, the sort of court case about the Muslim prayer room and the multiculturalism, are at least somewhat connected, right? So yes. Maybe you can do a quick overview of the prayer issue, and then your sense of multiculturalism and how you think about that.
Yeah, so we're a very strict school. We have silent corridors, for instance. Not everybody wants silent corridors. That's fine. We all do a particular family lunch, and then all the kids go outside and have fun time in the yard. We have a very multicultural intake that includes Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs and Christians and white kids and black kids and brown kids and everybody, really. And they all really get on with each other. They don't really think about race and religion. It's lovely. It's a lovely, lovely environment where multiculturalism is really does succeed. Now, it doesn't just succeed by accident. It succeeds because of all of the fine tuning that we do with our culture and with the school. And one kid and her mom decided to take us to court because we do not allow prayer on the premises. So some Muslims would like to pray while at school, you know, and when I say pray, do a prayer ritual. So obviously you can pray in your head as much as you like, but to take out a prayer mat, to spend 5-6 minutes or whatever it is on the ground praying in a particular area, especially when half the intake is Muslim, is huge, because it would mean opening up dozens of classrooms. It would mean moving dozens of desks. It would mean a huge disruption to the school. It would also mean splitting the Muslim kids from the non-Muslim kids. It would also mean putting pressure on the Muslim kids who don't want to pray to basically force them to pray. And you'd be pushing the Muslim kids upstairs to go and pray and pushing all the non-Muslim kids downstairs to go out in the yard. I refuse to divide children according to race and religion. It's not something that we offer. And so when people join the school, we tell them this. I tell them all sorts of things. We tell them that we don't have a sports hall, for instance. Unfortunately, we're in the inner city in a building that was, you know, not meant to be a school, so we don't have a sports hall. If you really like sport, team sports and things, we do a little bit in our yard, but we're very restricted from according to the building. Well, then they might not be the right school for you. Similarly, if you want to pray and as a Muslim, we might not be the right school for you. This mom, having agreed to all of that, then decided to change her mind. And so she took us to court, and she did lose because I made the argument that this is who we are. We make this very clear to everybody. She didn't have to choose the school. And that is where, you know, your big C conservatives, the possibility of choice matters, because it is true. She has choice to go somewhere else. So we won. And I think one of the reasons why or probably the main reason why we are so successful with our multiculturalism is precisely because we ask all groups to make a sacrifice for the betterment of the whole. So we all eat vegetarian food, for instance, at lunch, because the Hindus eat meat but no beef. The Muslims eat meat but no pork. The some people are vegetarian. We all eat vegetarian, and that means we can all sit together and break bread together and chat. You know, like if on the other hand, when we first started the school, we allowed meat, and then I realized we had to divide everybody up according to their race and religion, and I thought I don't want to do that. So our systems are set up in such a way so that everybody can be friends with each other, and it works very well, and we are very happy together. We also all buy into the same values, right? So all the values I was talking about at the beginning, we all exist under that umbrella of values, which we all buy into, whatever our backgrounds, and we're kind to each other. The kids here, I mean, it's hard to describe to people who haven't been here, which is why I'm always inviting people to come, and we get 800 visitors every year, to see how lovely the children are with each other. So I'm not just proud of the fact that our multiculturalism works. I'm proud of the fact that our kids are nice. They're decent people who, who I'm proud of for who they are. People always congratulate us for the results that we get in the school, our national GCSE exams with our 16-year-olds, where schools are ranked across the country for the progress that they've made with the kids. For the last 3 years running, we've been top of the country for our results. So we're obviously doing very well academically, but that's not the thing I'm most proud of. I'm most proud of the children and who they are as people. And we just had some guests today. I spoke to them, and it's always the case. All the guests are always beaming, saying, gosh, the kids were so lovely. Our guides were so nice. Oh my goodness. They can't believe how engaged the children are, how resilient and driven and happy they are, you know? So yeah, that for me is the most important thing. Schools are engines of socialization, and they create the adults that are going to fill the country and lead the country. And I think we should take them really seriously. Unfortunately, weirdly, nobody seems to take schools seriously because they I think everybody just thinks anybody can be a teacher, everybody goes to school, doesn't make any difference what our schools are like, and they don't realize that they make or break a country.
Yeah, I would echo that sentiment. I wrote a blog post quite some time ago saying something, we should make it as easy as possible for teachers to do great work. And that was in part because somebody who I would say was very likely sort of right-coded here in the States, basically said, express that sentiment that, teaching is easy. They get time off, and, it's a cakewalk. I'm like, boy, it's a terrible misunderstanding. I mean, you can certainly teach that way, I suppose. There are teachers who sort of embody that caricature, but certainly not ones who are actively working. What's the sort of center or the pushback on the multiculturalism issue that you're getting? What are the pieces that they're objecting to in the work that you're doing at Michaela?
Okay, so if coming back to the values, if victimhood is really important to the way in which you view the world, so you believe that there are different victim groups. You might have an LGBT victim group, a Black victim group, a trans victim group, a girls victim group, a special needs victim group, people who suffer from mental health victim group. There's so many different victim groups nowadays, and some of them have banners. They all have a particular identity. If that's how you see the world, either through your own lens of victimhood, because you consider yourself to be a victim, or you just see everybody else in those victim categories, and you feel guilty about your own privilege for not being in one of those victim groups. If you see it like that, it's very hard to then hold children to account if you consider them to be part of a different victim group. So when I say hold them to account, expect them to behave really well, expect them to be driven, to have goals, expect them to do their homework. And when it's not done 100% done really well, you hold them to account, you put them in detention, and then you get them to do it again. It means that you will necessarily lower your standards for those children because you believe that they cannot meet your standards because of their victim status. Now, if on the other hand, you see everybody as being the same, whether or not they might be Black or gay or a girl or whatever it is, doesn't matter. Dad isn't in the home, parents don't have much money. It doesn't matter. Whatever it is, you treat all the kids the same. It then forces those children, whether they belong in a victim group or not, to stop viewing themselves as victims and to instead feel empowered to jump over the obstacles that might lie in front of them. Now, I'm not saying there are not obstacles in front of them. Of course, my kids in the inner city have more obstacles in front of them than some rich kids in the private school. I'm not suggesting that the obstacles aren't there. I'm simply saying, what do we do about them? And what you don't do is keep talking about the obstacles and then view yourself as somebody who has got so many obstacles in front of you. How on earth are you going to do it? Because I can tell you what happens is the kid gives up, and you're not empowering them. You're not helping them. You're actually failing them as adults in their lives. And I think it's our role as teachers to give kids the confidence and the sense of empowerment to be able to do anything they want with their lives. And that is how you enable social mobility for them. By teaching them well so that they can take the knowledge and the skills and the confidence to be able to change their stars.
Yeah, it reminds me of a story, if you'll indulge me just for a moment. You'd asked about my daughters before we started recording.
Mm.
And my oldest does dance. And a year or so ago, she did her first solo. And she'd never done a solo before, which means you're on stage in a competition all by yourself. It's nerve-wracking for me to watch, right? And
Yeah.
she's trying to remember this whole thing. And I'm watching the first time, and halfway through, she forgets her dance and doesn't, sort of freezes and does a little bit more and then freezes. And obviously very embarrassing, really, really difficult. She comes off stage. Everybody and their brother was, consoling her, saying she did great. She was, people didn't notice and all these things. I said, absolutely not. You failed spectacularly. Now, what are you going to do about it? Right? This is life. In 10 years from now, you'll think, what a crazy, that was laughable kind of at this point. Are you going to try? Are you going to grow from it? What are you going to do? She went out again. She failed again.
Right.
And 2 weeks later, did it a third time and did it just fine. She's fine. She's hopefully that's empowering. So the message that we want to send to kids is that failure's okay. You tried, you failed. Don't let people tell you that you did just fine, because clearly
Yes.
you didn't. And what do you do, and how do you grow from that? So
Yes, exactly.
yeah. So switching gears a little bit here. So you and I have exchanged quite a few messages on Twitter. It's been a while on the matter of inquiry. I actually was watching your interview or your talk with the famous Jordan Peterson, who is quite a character. That must have been quite an experience. One of the things that struck me in that conversation was the sort of disagreement or discussion on teaching kids what to think and how to think, which I think gets largely, or at least somewhat largely, in towards the conversation that you and I have had about the role of inquiry and inquiry teaching and traditional teaching. What would you say, let me describe how I think about education and instructional approaches. See if this makes sense to you and how you would describe it differently. So I think about it and often describe it as a spectrum. Sort of on one end, you might have the more traditional teaching, the worst versions of that, sort of the drill and kill lecture and, the most boring kind of caricature that sometimes folks will straw man traditional teaching as, but there are teachers that do that kind of thing, right? On the all the way on the other end, you might have sort of the free school model where kids are doing that sort of pure discovery learning, adults sort of just being the chaperone to make sure the place isn't burning down. I would say that in between, there's most schools. Your approach, I would say, is certainly more towards the more traditional side. I think you would agree, but that there's a sort of spectrum along, places along that spectrum of guidance and inquiry and the role of inquiry. And, again, all the way out on one end, sort of a caricature that doesn't happen very often, that discovery, that sort of free school. And on the other end, there's sort of the caricature that hopefully doesn't happen very often, but often straw man version of that sort of boring, dry lecture, drill and kill. Somebody characterized it as sit and spit. But that's how I think about it, and trying to figure out where in that spectrum the school and teacher might need to be based on what they're trying to accomplish, what those desirable academic outcomes are, would determine what instructional approach they might take. So tell me how that makes sense to you and how you might disagree.
I don't disagree. I agree with everything you've just said.
Okay. All right. So, so getting back to the teaching students what to think, not how to think, and I think Jordan Peterson was talking about it sort of in terms of ideological, sort of the left indoctrination, or sometimes now the right. Certainly, we've got some Christian nationalism here in the States of really pushing that. So that, I think, is different from the way you're characterizing it and the role of knowledge, right? So you're stressing
No.
knowledge.
I was responding to him specifically. So when the right, I think, understandably, is horrified by some of the things that we are teaching children in schools.
Mm-hmm.
I, for instance, don't think that toddlers should be going to drag queen reading sessions in libraries. I don't really understand why that's happening. Some of the books that I think children are being exposed to in schools, in particular in America, are inappropriate from a sexual point of view. I think that our jobs in schools really is more to teach them maths and English rather than some of the stuff that is being taught. So I would agree very much with the right in America on that. But what the right, like Jordan Peterson, so I was arguing with Jordan Peterson. He and I were not agreeing.
Right.
And I was telling him essentially that he was wrong about his take on education. And I have to say, you know, credit to him, he was listening to me. What I was trying to explain is, because what they do is they say, oh my goodness, these teachers are all Marxists, and they're all telling our kids all this stuff that's wrong. What we need is to get teachers to teach them how to think, not what to think. And I'm saying, no. You do need to get kids to teach them what to think. It's just that at the moment we might be teaching them the wrong stuff. It's just, you need to teach them the right stuff. I believe, for instance, it's really important to teach children right from wrong. I don't think that you give a child, a toddler, I wouldn't sit two toddlers down and each with a hammer and give them one toy and say, okay, guys, you figure it out. You learn how to think and how to discipline yourselves and how to sort out the issue that there's only one toy. Because I don't think children are capable of figuring it out on their own. I don't. They'll just beat each other to death with the hammers. That's what's going to happen. I think we need to teach them the difference between right and wrong. And so when the toddler goes to take the toy and won't give the toy to the other toddler, we say, no, you need to share. And then you would show them what it is to share. And then when they still don't get it, you say, no. And then when they do it properly and one of them gives the toy to the other one, you say, well done, that's so brilliant. And through praise and punishment, the child learns right from wrong. Now, that's just one example. There's a million ways. They go to run across the street. No, you're not to run across the street. Hold mommy's hand. And then they hold their hand. Oh, well done. You held my hand. And that's the sort of thing that you do throughout their entire lives. We are constantly teaching them what to think. The idea that children can be taught how to think like that just by saying, you go to it, I think is a bit mad. So that is what I was saying to Jordan Peterson, that we need to teach them what to think. And that I do believe there is a right and wrong when it comes to the things that we should teach them. We could teach them that murder is okay, or we can teach them that murder is wrong. I don't think we just let them observe murder and then figure out whether or not they think it's right or wrong. No, I think they need to be taught this. And I think that children, if you don't teach them these things, well, they'll become a bit feral, really. They need to be given order and structure and taught how to behave. And when you teach them how to behave, my goodness, what is possible? So, yeah, now that doesn't mean, and I think the same thing goes for the knowledge, like I'm talking morality there, but it maps on perfectly to the knowledge point. I think there is some truth in what you say about inquiry. I mean, I wouldn't call it that. I would call it doing something with the knowledge, analyzing it, twisting it round, thinking about it, and so on. But I think that, so I'm not suggesting that a teacher stand up in front of the class and simply read to the class and that everybody just sits there. I remember teaching in South Africa once, spent a whole summer there working in a school, and the teachers would stand at the front of the class and look at a textbook, and there'd be 200 kids in front of them, and they'd go, is that clear? And all the class would say, yes. And then they go, is that clear? Yes. Right. They're thinking, this is crazy.
Yeah, that's the caricature that I described on the one end.
I have seen it with my own eyes. So I am most certainly not suggesting that. That's ridiculous. Obviously, you want the children to engage with what you're talking about and what you're teaching them. I think it's the teacher's role to lead the learning, to choose what they're going to teach. Then they need to teach it. So they need to explain it. they need to break it down in such a way so the child can understand it. And then they can build up slowly. And then you might give the child different exercises that are similar, depending, let's say it's math, or, you might give them a little paragraph to write if it's English, where they're using the knowledge that you have explained to them, that it's been broken down for them, and then they can build it back up and analyze it and do it in a different way. So the math exercise that you're doing is not the exact same exercise that they were taught. It'll be slightly different, but they can then use the knowledge that they've got to be able to work their way through. And then afterwards, you will have a class discussion perhaps with the teacher to figure out, have we all got this? And the teacher's looking and thinking, yes, I think everybody's there. Now we'll move on to the next thing. And that you do that lots and lots and lots. By doing that, the child gains more and more knowledge. I think people should think of that knowledge as sort of coat pegs in their heads. And the more knowledge that you have, the more knowledge of new knowledge can then Velcro itself to those coat pegs. And it keeps hanging on until you've just got a mind full of tons of knowledge. And that knowledge isn't about, I'm just sat down memorizing a whole load of things. Within that gaining of knowledge is analysis and conversation and thinking and coming up with your own thoughts about things. I quite like this author for this reason, but I don't like this author as much. Obviously, when you're smaller, there will be less of that thinking. But as you get older, you will have built so much knowledge in your head that you are then able to apply that knowledge in all kinds of ways. In ways you're in your geography class, but you bring in something that you learned from history or from English, and that you're connecting all that knowledge all of the time. And that's how you make kids really smart, basically. That's what we do here.
So all of that resonates with me. And one of the things that I think is a truism is that there's a tribalism at play in almost everything that we're doing anymore, right? And there's sort of this, what I would say, false binary, false dichotomy between sort of direct or explicit instruction and inquiry. As a side note, inquiry is, in my view, can be many things. Can be discovery learning, which I think is generally not what happens in most schools, but there's a conflation in educational research that inquiry is discovery learning. There's lots of ways in which inquiry can show up in teaching and learning that is not discovery learning. But there's just this, like, this is my camp, that's my camp, right? So I have people say, basically operating and talking as though inquiry is the enemy or direct or explicit instruction is the enemy. And my advocacy is for yes and, not either or. And one of the things that I contend is that folks who do, more traditional teaching, like what you're explaining, actually use a fair amount of inquiry and just have a hard time. I mean, it's almost a messaging problem, a marketing problem, right? It's like, I don't want to say that I'm using inquiry because that's the other side, right?
Oh, no, I'm not. I mean, look, I say I wouldn't call it inquiry. I mean, I don't, because that's just not what I say. I mean, I have no idea. I'm happy to call what we do whatever. I don't care. I mean, Drew, in many, I wish you could come and see us. I mean, and you're very welcome to come and see what we do here, because
as do I.
Be interested to see what you think. I don't know.
It's on my list. Yeah.
You'd look at our classes and I have no idea what you think.
Yeah.
You went in and went, oh gosh, well, this is them doing some inquiry here. Well, fine. I don't know. I have no idea. I'm telling you what we do,
Mm-hmm. Right.
What we don't do is set them off and say, okay, you figure this out. That doesn't happen. They're always starting from a base of knowledge of what in what they're doing, and it's the teacher who is leading that classroom. Teacher knows very much where they want to get to at the end of the lesson. I'm just describing to you what we do.
So what I talk about and have been advocating for is that we call it knowledge-rich inquiry, because I think the sort of constructivist progressive side has has left out of the conversation the role of knowledge and the importance of knowledge. People who say, teachers who say, educators who say, advocates who say, oh, well, they can just Google it, or something like that, I am sharply critical of, because they do need knowledge. It's absolutely necessary. What knowledge that is, certainly something that we can debate. I'm sympathetic to Edie Hirsch's argument of shared cultural knowledge and all those kinds of things. But we do need knowledge. And so what I think about is, how do we align the instruction? And we should absolutely know what we want students to be engaged, not just behaviorally engaged, but cognitively, academically, intellectually engaged. We want them to think about, and in ways we want them to think about. And you're describing, hey, these are the things I want them to learn, think about, and I want them to think about it in this way, and then in this way, and then this way, and analyze it and discuss it. And we want them to learn about the things we want them to learn about. And there's, I think, some subtle distinctions between thinking and learning that are important. So then you say, well, what are the instructional approaches that we use to do that? Well, we use explicit or direct instruction, and there are differences that we don't need to get into here. We use inquiry processes, and I would say collaborative activities as appropriate. Teachers need to know what they want students to learn. They need to have content fluency. They need to have good instructional resources, and they need to know the prior academic achievement, basically the abilities of their students, so that they can meet them where they are.
Yeah.
And so when I think about, and we talk about inquiry teaching, I'm trying to, in some ways, dispel, be sharply critical of folks who are, really basically saying teachers shouldn't teach. Like, if a teacher says to me in our workshops, wait, I'm not supposed to teach this, right? I say, absolutely not. If you're not teaching it, then why are you here, right? And if you haven't figured out that cognitive path you want them to travel, then before you start, then that's a problem too. But the inquiry process can look a lot of different ways. It can be a priming effect. It can be a formative assessment. And I imagine, I would not have ever believed, and I think this is a mistake that people do in the sort of tribalism game. They would say, oh, Michaela, all they do is drill and kill, lecture, that kind of thing. And I would say there's no way that they're doing just that.
Well, no. I mean, our kids wouldn't be able to have the kinds of conversations that they can have if we were doing that. Nor would they be as interested in learning as they are. Our lessons, the kids are just constantly engaging with the teacher. The hands are up all the time. They're turning to their partners 30, 40 times in the lesson. The teacher says, tell me what this is. Turn to your partners, go. And then they go, blah, 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 blah. And then they say, right, hands up. And then the kids give the answer. And then they say, okay, so tell me this now. Okay, now I'm going to teach you this. Da, 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 da. Okay, now everybody get down and then you're going to do this. And then the kids write something down. And then there's no, the idea of anybody standing in front and just drilling them over and over again, that just simply doesn't happen. There are certain things that we expect the kids to memorize. So we expect them to memorize their times tables. We expect them to memorize historical dates or their French verbs. But there are some things that lend themselves very well to memorization. But clearly you can't memorize Macbeth. You read Macbeth, you take Macbeth apart, you understand all the different characters, and then you write different essays on Macbeth, and you have conversations with your teacher and with the kids on other kids on that. So, but in order for you to understand Macbeth, your teacher does need to tell you. You're not going to just figure it out on your own. Not unless, look, you might be able to figure it out on your own if you've read maybe 4 or 5 other Shakespeare plays before. And you really understand tragedy and what that means, and Shakespearean tragedy. Right. And you might then be able to access a Shakespeare play and think, okay, I'm able to do this without the support of the teacher having taught this to me before. It takes a long time to get to that level. That's all.
Right. Yeah, and that's the prior academic achievement part that I'm referencing, right? So you scaffold, just like student autonomy or anything, you give students the level of autonomy that they need, not more, and hopefully not less.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with you, totally. And so then when I was saying to Jordan Peterson, it's the same when it comes to the morality point. You have a little kid in front of you, and you're handing him a chocolate bar, and he goes to take the chocolate bar. And any good mom or dad goes, no, what do we say? And at first, the child won't know. And you'll say, please. You say please. Child takes a chocolate bar. Well done. Okay. Next time, what do we say? Puh, puh, puh. And then they say, please, well done. Here you go. Then you're scaffolding in that moment to try and help them. And then eventually it'll be, what do we say? Please. And then eventually the child is just going, please, can I have the chocolate bar? Please, can I have the chocolate bar? Well done, well done, well done. And when they don't, they try and grab it. No. And then they're being told, punished by parent going, no. And then when they do say please, they're rewarded by parents saying, well done, that's so good. Now, that's how we teach them. The idea of teaching them how to think in that moment. No, little one, you decide. Do you think saying please is a good idea, or would you rather say something else? What? He's a child. He needs to just be told this is what you do, and you teach him what to think. And then eventually when he's 25 and he decides to be a radical and says, I'm never going to use the word please because I think it's outrageous and it's white oppression or whatever it is, right? He can then decide
patriarchal.
No, but he can't decide to do that at 5. We need to be teaching them what to do and how, and then they do it, and the how to do it, and then, but they're not coming up with their own ideas. I mean, they can only come up with their own ideas once they've been taught all the other stuff first. That is what I'd say, and that is what we do. And our kids, people don't come here and say, oh my goodness, your kids have memorized so much stuff. I'm literally, like, we've had 7,000 visitors to school. Nobody ever says that. What people say is, my goodness, your kids, they're so chatty. They're so great at conversation. They say, gosh, they're really sure about what they think, aren't they? They're so resilient and they're so driven and they're so engaged with their learning, They'll talk about the books that the kids are reading and how impressive it is and how the kids are just so interested in learning stuff, And that's the thing about the coat pegs in the head. When you have all these coat pegs of knowledge in your head, when you have knowledge, you want more knowledge because you're interested in more knowledge. So people often think that the way to get a kid interested in Shakespeare, for instance, is to, let's say, rap Shakespeare, okay? Make it fun and engaging. Mm-hmm. But if you rap Shakespeare, you're doing it on such a superficial level that you're not actually really accessing Shakespeare properly. Mm-hmm. The way to get kids to love Shakespeare is to teach them Shakespeare. It's to break it down and make it accessible. And the more you do that, the more interested they're going to become. And the more you do it, the more they are then eventually going to be able to break it down themselves. That's what you're doing. You're teaching them to get to a point where you take the training wheels off the bike and the child is able to go on their own. But because we've lowered our standards so much for what we imagine kids can do. There was somebody on Twitter recently, a guy I know here in London, who was talking about another guy who does a lot of, rapping with, Shakespeare and Black Boys in the Inner City. I don't have a problem with that. He does it after school. It's an after school thing. Great. I'm 100% supportive of that. But I'd say it's not good enough, right? And what he was saying was, yeah, well, so-and-so's introduced more Black boys to Shakespeare than you have. And I thought, well, I don't really know if that's true. I mean, I have been doing this for 25 years. But even if it were true, he's only introduced them to Shakespeare on a very superficial level. And yes, it's better than nothing. So I'm not saying that's a bad thing.
Sure.
And as an extracurricular activity, which is fun, that's brilliant. But it's our job to delve into the depth of Shakespeare. The moral lessons that can be learned from Shakespeare. My goodness, this is where I'd say to Jordan Peterson, well, that's what we need to do. We need to teach them what to think. You don't read Othello and think, yeah, well, Iago, he was all right, actually. I think it was good, him screwing over his friend like that. I mean, nobody thinks that. What you think is, or what you teach the kids is, look at jealousy that happens to Othello. Look at how the evil Iago is able to manipulate his friend because he falls to jealousy in this way. Look at and the great universal values that I was just talking about that should encompass us all, that can make multiculturalism work. You access that through Shakespeare. And but if all you're doing is rapping, then you're just you're never going to see the meaning of life, is what I'd say.
Well, I imagine, though, somebody might say, well, this is one way in which one interpretation of Shakespeare or Othello, but there are other ways to interpret it. And so sort of those multiple perspectives. And that gets into, I think some of the differences between knowledge and understanding. Do kids know this is the way that most people think about it? This is the sort of traditional interpretation of Shakespeare, but then there are different ways to look at it. We don't have time to get into critical theory, but that's, critical theory looks at from different lens, which is not necessarily right or wrong, or you can disagree with it, but it's just another perspective. And one of the things that I'm concerned about, again, I've sort of voiced some of the criticisms from the right, from the sort of constructivists, the dismissal or leaving out of sort of the importance of knowledge and that kind of thing. But there's, I think, a movement from the more traditional side that's basically all you have to do is just tell them, or at least that's the messaging that happens, and that inquiry, again, is the enemy. There's a podcast I did with Oliver Caviglioli, who, has done a lot of illustrations for the science of learning kinds of things, and he asked, I thought was a really important distinction or question, is like, the question seems to be a lot about how do we get kids to know things, but not as much about what do we do when they do. What do we do with that? And you've kind of addressed that, but I think that often gets left out of a lot of that conversation from the sort of science of learning crowd, because efficiency, and inquiry can be inefficient and that kind of thing.
When you say about different interpretations of Shakespeare, I would say, sure, you get to university and you've now read, and you'll be lucky if you've read 4 Shakespeare plays. Like, we read 4 Shakespeare plays here at Michaela. That is quite rare, okay? In lots of schools, you'll read 1. And if you read Romeo and Juliet, which is certainly not, one of the better Shakespeare plays. When I say better, the depth of Othello or King Lear or Macbeth does not come in Romeo and Juliet. But if all you've done is read Romeo and Juliet, and if all you've done is possibly just watch the film with Leonardo DiCaprio and read a few extracts from the play, and then you say, I know Shakespeare, you don't know Shakespeare. Now, once you perhaps read 4 or 5 plays really well, and you understand what Shakespeare does, and you go to university and they say, you know what, let's look at some critical, theory on Othello, and look at Iago, and people think that he's an evil character, but actually look at this guy who's arguing that Iago's actually the protagonist we should all look to and learn from, let's say. Well, I'm quite happy with that. Of course I am. Brilliant. That means that we've done our jobs at high school. It means that we've given them the tools that they need to be able to do that kind of thinking later on. But if you do that stuff way too early, then nobody's actually learning anything, because you're doing it on a very superficial level, because you're pretending to have that kind of in-depth, analysis, which is simply impossible given the amount of knowledge that you currently got.
Well, I'm sure there are some folks who might be listening who would disagree with you, and I'm not a Shakespeare expert, so I'm not sure. But you're no stranger to being disagreed with. That's probably a good place to leave it off, because I know you have to go. I wish we had more time, because I have some notes and things that I would love to dive into, but maybe another time.
Yes.
Always a pleasure to talk with you. Maybe someday, it is on my list to get over to London. My oldest especially wants to go to London, so maybe I'll get over there and visit you, and we can have another, I don't think we had dinner, we had drinks or a coffee or something like that, but something like that. So again, thanks so much.
Yes, it would be lovely to see you. You must come, Drew. We'd love to have you.
All right.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.